Hello, everyone. Good morning. I am excited that we get to start our first talk of the day with a little bit of aging discussion. And so for those of you that haven't met me, Anna Shah, I am one of the neurologists here in our section. So we're going to try and group this into 4 different questions. I think in order for us to understand what happens with aging in MS, it's important to know what happens with normal aging. So we'll go through what is normal for whatever normal is, what happens with aging in MS, and then the bottom 2 are really the things I want us all to focus in on. I think it's something that's good for everyone, whether you have MS or not, but thinking about how do you slow down aging in MS, and what are we doing, whether we realize it or not, that's making our aging accelerated compared to where it might be. And so I'll go through some technical definitions first, and then we'll kind of get into it. So let's go through what happens with normal aging. So when you hear about aging, a lot of us think about aging as it refers to chronological age, meaning my birthday is this, I am this number of years old, I'm this number of months old, this number of days old. And when we think about aging, it's important to distinguish chronological aging from our biologic age. A lot of you have probably heard people say, well, I'm 70, but I feel like I'm 30, or I'm 20, but I feel like I'm 70. And a lot of that has to do with this idea of what is our biologic age, which is not something we can measure in terms of dates. It's really something that says, well, hey, how well are our body organs, are our tissues aging relative to our chronological age? So using biomarkers or other indices to kind of indicate what our biological age may be. And I'm going to bring into this conversation this idea of something called telomeres. And I don't think this is something we really talk quite a bit about. I don't think we've ever had an Ed Summit that's included this, so I thought I would explain what that is a little bit more. So this is something that's at the end of all of our chromosomes. So we've got all of our cells, we've got our DNA, and then we've got our chromosomes. And at the ends of all of those are these things called telomeres. And telomere length can be used to determine biological age. Now, this is not something that's simple, like checking your blood sugars or something like that in terms of blood tests. But we know these telomeres, what are at the ends of our chromosomes, shorten naturally as we age. And we know people that have shorter telomere lengths, also called telomere attrition, are associated with aging-related disorders. So we see shorter telomere lengths associated with cardiovascular disease, with dementia, mortality, and I'll get into, yes. I sure can. Can you not hear? Is this better? Okay. Do I need to repeat what I just said? Should I do it again? I'll say it again. So when we talk about telomeres, so we've got cells. All of our cells have DNA, and all of the DNA has chromosomes in it. And at the end of all of our chromosomes, the thing you see in red on the screen is what we call telomeres. And now telomeres are something that naturally decrease or shorten in terms of length as we age. And it's something that we can use to measure our biological age as opposed to our chronological age. And we know this becomes important, and we'll get into how it relates to MS in a minute. But as these telomeres shorten in length or in duration, we know that's associated with some of these diseases we think about as we age, like heart disease, dementia, and increased risk of death. Okay, and then we'll also take another second to talk about something called neurologic reserve. And I know this is one that we talk quite a bit about at summits and some of these conversations that we've had. But what is a neurologic reserve? I kind of think about it, if we're making an analogy, to kind of thinking about it as your financial reserve, meaning if something was to happen, if an event was to happen, like a big sudden expense or healthcare related expense, do you have enough in the bank to kind of be able to buffer out for that unexpected change? So similarly, neurologic reserve, the definition of it, is the ability of the brain to effectively buffer changes associated with normal aging and cope with pathological damage. And this is something we see that comes up quite a bit in MS, where we say sometimes we see patients that have dozens of brain lesions, but when we're thinking about how does it affect them on a day-to-day functionality, they say not really much. Versus there's others where we say there's just a handful of lesions, but those handful of lesions are creating much more significant quality of life changes or day-to-day functioning. So there are things for everybody, again, applying to everybody, that we consider positive contributors to our neurologic reserves, and then negative or detractors from our neurologic reserve. And a lot of it's probably what you normally think of us emphasizing. So healthy lifestyle, meaning good diets, regular physical exercise, sleep, good stress management, cognitive engagement. All of those are positive contributors to our neurologic reserve. And then detractors, aging, well, we can't really control that one a ton. Comorbidities, so thinking about things that are what we consider vascular comorbidities, like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. Smoking is a huge one. And then poorly controlled neurologic disease can also be a detractor from one's neurologic reserve. So let's jump in to what happens with aging and MS. So you hear a lot of us talking a lot about, well, what do our natural history studies show? What do we know about aging as it relates to chronological age? And again, chronological age being the number based on your birthday. So we know there are differences that happen with chronological age. For example, we know kids that are diagnosed with MS have higher relapse rates than adults. Similarly, those that are younger tend to have higher relapse rates than those that are older. We know that those that get diagnosed with MS at an older age of onset have faster rates of decline in relapse rates. Those with pediatric onset MS take longer to reach kind of secondary progressive. And those that are diagnosed older with MS take a shorter time to reach disability milestones. And what I mean by disability milestones is I mean things like using a cane, using a walker, using a wheelchair. We also, and this has been something that's been in the news quite a bit, or in MS publications, is this idea of smoldering MS, or what we also call chronic active MS. And this is a description that's really based on a pathologic description, meaning if you take a picture or you take a piece of a lesion and you look at it under a microscope, what does it look like? And what we often see when we talk about smoldering MS or smoldering lesions is this area around the lesion itself that has activated microglia. Microglia are a normal cell that resides in our brain. And we see this activation, so something that indicates chronic inflammation. And that really, one of the biggest impacts it has is it allows for poor remyelination. So when we think about people that have these smoldering lesions or chronically active lesions, where do we see them more often? In progressive MS, which I've already kind of illustrated. We see progressive MS more with chronological age. We usually see it more in people that have had the disease for over 10 years. But we actually see this peak around the age of 50, which I think is interesting. The other thing that I think is really interesting when we think about aging in MS is there's been a few studies that have showed us that new MS lesions after the age of 35 are less likely to remyelinate and more likely to become chronic active or smoldering lesions. So let's go back to the telomeres that we spent so much time on just a few minutes ago. So we know we also see shortening of telomeres in MS. And it's interesting because there have been a few different telomere studies, nothing huge, but interesting studies nonetheless. One that showed, hey, we see shorter telomere length. So again, the capping at the end of the chromosomes related to primary progressive MS compared to those that did not have MS. There was another study that also showed a shorter telomere length in all MS patients, regardless of what their subtype was. But I think one of the things that's the most interesting is when we see a shorter telomere length, we see a higher association with disability. So things that we can measure and things that are a little bit harder to measure. So things like walking, so needing something to help you walk, we see an association with this. We see an association with cognitive decline, and we see an association with fine motor dysfunction as well. When we look at MRI scans, we also see more of what we consider gray matter atrophy. So our brain is separated into both white and gray matter. We often think about MS affecting just the white matter, but we know gray matter gets affected in MS as well. And if you've gotten MRI scans recently, we've started implementing these new brain volumetric softwares, which we're kind of excited about, which will show us kind of what gray matter volume looks like over the years. The annual rates of brain volume loss in MS are somewhere between 0.3 to 1%, depending on the study you look at. But it's really hard because it's hard to discern between what is normal aging and what is pathologic, meaning what is related to MS. The other thing that I think is important for us to look at is something called neurofilament light. And we've had several talks, I think, about neurofilament light levels. In healthy individuals, we think about these levels increasing in general with age, and sometimes it can be used as a good surrogate or a good biomarker for brain volume trajectories. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated in MS because we know that MS directly affects neurofilament light levels, so it's hard to make a direct one-to-one correlation with brain volume or kind of what your brain volume trajectory might look like. So we know relapses affect neurofilament light chain levels. We know lesions that are currently active, meaning those that are showing up bright with contrast, and chronic active lesions affect these too. So I think there's some utility in it, but we're not 100% sure how to apply this clinically in patients. The last point I would bring up, and this is kind of a whirlwind, and we could probably do another hour on talking about aging in MS, but is looking at the sex hormones and what difference do these sex hormones make as we age in MS. So with men, interestingly, of course, as we know, there's a decrease in testosterone levels as they age. And there has been a few small studies showing lower testosterone levels as a risk factor in the development of MS. We don't quite know how that affects the brain in human models. There have been some mouse models that have shown that lower testosterone levels indicates less chance of remyelination. And in women, this one's a little bit more well established, but we know we tend to see this perimenopausal decline that happens in women with MS in their 40s and 50s. And when we look at something called the anti-Müllerian hormone, which is a blood test that can be done that's a marker of ovarian reserve, we know that we can sometimes use that as a biomarker to capture early ovarian decline. So there have been some studies that have shown that this AMH level correlates with disability and maybe even with gray matter volumes. What we see in real life, or where does this impact us? We see that men tend to have more severe disease progression early on, whereas women, quote unquote, catch up after menopause. So interesting things. I think there's a lot of work being done looking at sex hormones as it relates to aging in MS, particularly in women around menopause. So now to get to the meat of it, well, how do we actually slow down aging? So when we used to kind of think about what does care of the MS patient look like, I think there was a big emphasis on disease-modifying therapies, which I don't want to detract from that. But I think where we think about it looking like now is going, well, disease-modifying therapies are incredibly important. We kind of talked about how these lesions can turn into chronic smoldering lesions, so the less lesions we have, always the better. But what about these other things? What about symptom control and lifestyle choices? Now, there have been other talks about symptom control, so I will bypass that one, but let's talk about what we can do from a lifestyle management standpoint to make sure that we're staying as healthy as possible from a brain standpoint and a body standpoint. So I often think about these three things when we think about staying active. A lot of people, when they think about staying active, your mind jumps to staying physically active. But the other things that become just as important is staying socially active and staying cognitively active. So let's talk about physical activity first. We kind of think about using 3 different domains of exercise. So cardiovascular exercise, where you feel like your heart rate is getting up, strength building, so whether that's weights or something like that, and then flexibility. My personal bias, especially if you're a patient of mine, you probably heard me talk about Pilates. I think Pilates does a really good job for MS patients of incorporating all 3. Hydrotherapy in MS becomes incredibly important. But the most important thing is this is meaningful in every single individual, regardless of disability level. So whether you can run triathlons or you go, hey, taking 5 steps is very challenging, there is some level of physical activity that you are still able to do and need to continue to do in order to maintain optimal health going forward. It is really easy to lose muscle mass, and so it's important to stay ahead of it rather than trying to play catch up. The second piece is remaining cognitively active. So what does that mean? I think my favorite analogy to use is kind of thinking about when we all first learned how to drive. And everybody remembers when they first learned how to drive, how many checkpoints you did. You were like, my hands are at 10 at 2, and I'm making sure I'm checking all my mirrors, and I'm really active. And it was a lot of work, right? Your brain kind of feels tired when you first learn. But after a while, kind of becomes automatic. And that's because it's become something that's habitual and you're not actively engaged in that as much. And so kind of thinking about learning or staying cognitively active as being that. I have some patients that say, well, I do crossword puzzles, but they're so easy for me. My brain doesn't feel tired after doing it. Well, then I go, I got to do something harder or harder crossword puzzles, right? So being cognitively active should be the same as being physically active, where you say, this has to feel hard, this has to feel challenging in order for your brain to actually be exercising. So thinking about things like continuous learning, reading, pursuing new activities, if there's a new instrument you've always been wanting to play, a new language you've been wanting to learn, kind of think about it as an exercise for your brain, and you're kind of doing your own physical therapy as part of learning that new thing. And then socially active, I think we can't overemphasize this one enough. There have been several studies that have shown, and this is not necessarily particularly in MS, but social isolation is one of the things that contributes to aging more rapidly. So making sure that you're engaged with social groups or peer support networks or whoever it is that makes you feel fulfilled. Now, of course, if you're one of those that says, gosh, I do these social engagements and I feel totally drained, I'm not telling you to go do that. But making sure that you're engaged and using conversational skills in a meaningful way as well. Diet, and I think there was a few questions on diet as it relates to MS. And this one's always one that we don't have a magic silver bullet, which I wish we did because it would be a lot easier to follow something very strict. But really what we say is with diet, the studies that we've done looking at diet in MS are really limited by the quality and the scope of a lot of trials. There hasn't been established through looking at kind of a meta-analysis or kind of a grouping of a lot of these trials that there is actually a significant impact on disability levels. But I will say that dietary changes can produce quite a big impact on fatigue and quality of life in certain patients. So what diet do we typically talk about? What diet has the best data behind it in terms of aging and brain health? And that's really the Mediterranean diet. It has been shown to have a lower risk of depression and dementia as well, and promotes a diverse gut microbiome. So what does that kind of look like? A variety of nuts, seeds, legumes, healthy oils, lots of fiber, oily fish is a big part of it. And I think avoiding the things that most people here probably say, all right, well, I didn't need you to tell me to avoid that. Things like excess salt, processed or ultra-processed foods, deep fried foods, junk foods. Now, it does not mean you can't have those once in a while, but making sure that that's not a staple in your diet. The other two things that I'll emphasize for optimal lifestyle management, again, none of this is necessarily particularly unique to MS, but we know the impacts this has on MS is quite greater than someone I would consider without MS. So sleep is critically important. I know we've done some talks about the importance of sleep, but really thinking about what your quality of sleep and your quantity of sleep. I have some patients that say, well, I go to bed at 9, I wake up at 6, I'm getting 9 hours of sleep. And you go, okay, well, that should be enough. But if you're waking up every 2 hours to use the bathroom because of your bladder, then we go, okay, you're getting enough quantity, but that quality is not great because you need continuous sleep to hit those REM cycles. So looking at both of those things together and not either one in isolation. We also know MS increases risk of sleep disorders like sleep-related breathing disorders, things like sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, periodic limb movement disorders, and a lot of other things that can impact quality of sleep. So that an early identification of sleep disorders or sleep issues becomes incredibly important to not only day-to-day functioning, but long-term functioning in terms of decreasing risk of dementia. The last piece is emotional well-being, which I think is more important than probably previously known. We know that things like depression and anxiety can sometimes mimic dementia, so much so that in the medical world we call it pseudo-dementia, meaning something that looks exactly like dementia. The only difference being there's not necessarily the abnormal protein folding or something like that that we see in Alzheimer's dementia. So when we think about emotional well-being, trying to address, well, hey, am I feeling more anxious than maybe I would have or more depressed? We know MS also has a direct implication on that just purely from its impact on the brain. So paying attention to things like that, staying ahead of it, looking at counseling and therapy for mental health, engagement in activities that help promote emotional well-being, things like meditation and yoga. And I do like to emphasize there's a big difference between good stress and bad stress. And I think I see a lot of people nodding. And so we know that there's some stressors where we say, okay, I'm someone that does well in the setting of X, Y, or Z stresses, and I can do this, versus when I get stressed by this, whether it's work or family or whatever it is, that causes a flare-up in my MS symptoms, and that's clearly not a good stress. Okay, and on to our last piece, which is what are things that we're doing, may not realize, that are accelerating our aging in MS. So we think a lot about this comorbidity management, and comorbidity is basically a fancy way of saying what other disease problems, what other diagnoses have I been diagnosed with that can directly impact my MS. So there was this study looking at over 23,000 MS patients and really found that except for high lipids or high cholesterol, MS patients had a higher frequency of all comorbid illnesses. The most common one, depression, which I already kind of alluded to, that MS increases the risk of depression. And then high blood pressure. We saw that at a much higher rate, especially in men with MS compared to healthy controls. The other things that we saw that I think are really quite remarkable is diabetes and ischemic heart disease, so cardiovascular disease. And why is that important? So this is a nice chart that was published back in 2010, so a little bit old, but still very relevant, where we say, well, what does it look like? How long can people go without needing something to help them walk? Meaning kind of a marker that we're using as a marker for disability. And so what you see is the solid line is someone that did not have a vascular comorbidity. And when I talk about vascular comorbidity, I'm referring to high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, or smoking. And what you see is that in those people that had none of those, it took them much longer on average to reach needing something to help them ambulate or walk than it did those that had one or more of those vascular comorbidities. And now some of this, I might hear some people say, well, everyone in my family has high blood pressure. You can't change your genetics, right? That's just part of you, and that is what it is. But making sure if you are someone that says, I have a really strong family history of high blood pressure, what am I going to do? I'm going to make sure I'm exercising regularly. I'm going to make sure I'm taking my blood pressure regularly. So if it is something that I get despite all of my lifestyle changes, then I'm on medication early, so I'm not one of those that has uncontrolled vascular risk factors. The other thing that I can't emphasize enough is smoking. There have been several studies showing not only the risk of smoking in association with the development of MS, but several studies showing how smoking is the number one factor that leads to rapid accumulation of disability. So the way I like to think about it is if you're doing all these other things to decrease your risk of accumulating disability, meaning slowing down rate of brain atrophy or cognitive issues or walking issues, then this is something that becomes an important mainstay, plus all the other benefits that come with not smoking. So what do we think about comorbidity management? I kind of talked about the blood pressure a little bit, but really focusing in, and I think this is where we think about a care team with your neurologist and your primary care doctor being critically important, making sure that it's not just, I've got my MS under control, I don't need to see my primary, but making sure that there's not other things underlying which could have an indirect effect on your MS. And I think that's it for me today. Thank you.